Martin Niemuller was a German Lutheran pastor who made this very, very famous statement after the end of World War II. And he talked to this topic several times, so there are very different versions of what I'm going to read. The version I'm going to read comes from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And here's what Martin Niemuller had to say. They came first for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. Then they came for me, and by that time, there was nobody left to speak up. As I said, Martin Niemuller was a German Lutheran pastor born in 1892, and he actually supported Hitler when Hitler came to power. But when Hitler began to state that the state was supreme over religion, Niemuller became disillusioned with Hitler. So he became actually the leader of a group of clergy who opposed Hitler, together with people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So in 1937, he was arrested and spent the rest of the war hadn't started yet, 2 years down the road, spent the next 9 years in concentration camps. In 1945, he was released from Dachau by the Allied forces. And then he continued in his career as a clergyman. He became a kind of the leading voice of penance and reconciliation in Germany. And this piece, First They Came For, that I just read to you, he was talking about the cowardice of German intellectuals, and indeed lots of the clergy, and he included himself in that, for failing to oppose the Nazi power move. As they watched the incremental purging of group by group by group, it was the communists, and then it was the Jews, it was the trade unionists, it was the disabled, the euthanasia problem, it was gays, it was gypsies. One by one, each of these groups is annihilated. And Niemuller would spend the rest of his life, repenting in some stages and warning us against any movement that sequentially begins to purge particular groups in society. I certainly, personally, have never been guilty of that kind of cowardice. I spent my life, because of the family from which I've come, trying to oppose injustice and untruth. In the very first homily I gave this year in January of 2020, I called it my 2020 vision of America in the year 2020. And I outlined a vision I had for our country. Since that time, in the last 6-7 months, I've personally watched in horror as I looked at the organized fragmentation of our country. And so I'm going to call today's homily, I will call it Defending My Country, the United States of America. And I'm going to make 5 main points this morning. Firstly, I want to talk about American history. Secondly, I want to examine this notion of white privilege. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about my own particular journey. Fourthly, I'm going to talk about what I see as the war on democracy. And then fifthly, I'm going to talk about a way forward out of this situation. So they're the 5 points I make this morning. American history. This country was the greatest experiment in democracy ever launched on planet Earth. In 1776, it was a shining light to the nations of the world, an experiment in real democracy. There had been attempts at democracy in ancient Athens away 2,500 years ago. But this was the first real effort at a national level to create an experiment in democracy. And of course, there were faults in it. It was the beginning of a movement. But over the next 244 years, one by one, we've managed to address the gaps in that model. The suppression of women, the fact that women couldn't vote, the slavery, and Native American Indian rights. So Year by year by year, we've attempted to undo the discrepancies and to grow this experiment in democracy. America gives more freedoms to its citizens than any other country in the world. It is the only country to ever declare an emancipation proclamation, when in 1862, during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, through an executive order, created an emancipation proclamation. There is no other country in the world that has never done that. It is the only country in the world that actually fought a war against slavery, in which hundreds of thousands of people, mainly white Christian men, gave their lives to end slavery. And it was white Christians who spearheaded the abolitionist movement, mainly the Quakers. There is no country in the world that has encouraged immigration from all parts of the world like this country has done. There are people in our country from every culture, every tribe, every nation in the world, and they're made welcome. In Silicon Valley alone, in that tiny little section of the South Bay, there are over 130 languages spoken. In the most recent census, 13.5% of all American citizens are foreign born, including myself. And there has never been more diversity in our Congress. Of the 535 members of Congress, 116 of those members are non-white. It's the greatest number ever in our history. So I think it becomes really, really important for us as we look at our nation and as we've just celebrated independence, that this has been the most extraordinary exercise in democracy in the history of the world. That's my first point. I want to examine for a few moments the notion of white privilege. And personally, I find this slogan to be deeply offensive. Martin Luther King, one of the greatest prophets of the 20th century, said in his most famous speech of all time, "People should be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin." So anybody who's using skin color as a way to lob bombs at other people, if you call a person a white supremacist or white privilege, you're making race an issue. It's no more acceptable to be racist against white people than it is to be racist against brown people or black people or red people. You're going to find prejudice within every group, and you're going to find prejudice among all groups. It's the nature of humanity that they try to create a pecking order wherever you find them. We got this even from our animal ancestors. If you've ever raised chickens, you know there's literally a literal pecking order in chickens. So you'll never find any group of people among whom there isn't prejudice among themselves and between other groups. What I have found, having had the privilege of living in 3 different continents, is that most prejudice is based on class distinctions, not on color distinctions. Because no matter what part of the world you go to, even when there's a kind of a homogeneous population of the same skin color, you're going to find prejudice. You're going to find it in Asia, you're going to find it in Africa, you're going to find it in South America, you're going to find it in Europe, that people have this innate need to create some kind of a pecking order. So when I hear the phrase white privilege, it is really upsetting to me. I looked at numbers a few days ago from the National Center for Children in Poverty. There are 13 million American children living under the poverty line, 13 million. Of those 13 million, 4.2 million are white children. 4 million are Latino children. 3.6 million are black children. 400,000 are Asian children, and 200,000 are Native American Indian tradition. So you look at the metrics, you know, and this notion that one group is really being preferred above the other, it doesn't square with the data. It becomes really important that we talk about facts before we start slinging slogans about. That's my second point. My third point, I want to look at my own journey vis-a-vis white privilege. In my own family, none of my grandparents ever got to high school. Of all my aunts and uncles, I had 9 aunts and uncles, only 2 of them actually managed to finish high school. for the simple reason that we were a very poor family living in a very poor country at the time, and they couldn't afford to have children in secondary school because they needed to go out and work. My father was a very, very brilliant man. He was forced to leave school at age 13. He spent the next 30 years of his life selling stamps as a clerk in the post office in Cork City. In his mid-40s, he did go to high school. He put himself through high school, having raised his kids, his own kids. And then he went on to college, and then he got a master's degree, and he spent the last 30 years of his life working as an archaeologist. When I look at what happened to my own aunts and uncles who left Ireland at age 13 and 14 and 15 because there was no employment in Ireland and went to England, again and again and again, there were signs in the shops in England, no Irish need apply. When I look at the history of my country, between 1845 and 1847, there was an artificially engineered famine that killed or forced people to emigrate. The population of Ireland went from 8 million people down to 4 million people in a 10-year period. On the 150th anniversary of that famous famine in 1995, the President of Ireland, a woman called Mary McAleese, an extraordinary woman, gave a speech on this 150th anniversary, and everybody was expecting that she's going to start pointing fingers at England and that colonialist rule that actually created this genocidal famine. There wasn't a famine. It was just a single crop failed, the potatoes. But because they were dependent on potatoes, even while they were exporting other crops, 4 million people either died or immigrated. And everybody's expecting she's going to give this rip-roaring homily in which she's going to point fingers at the English who caused that. She didn't mention that. She said, it is much more important for us in 1995 not to look at a famine that was created artificially 150 years ago for us Irish. It is much more important to look at other parts of the world which are suffering from artificially created famines right now. The focus is on helping those who are in need now, not pointing back and become victims of some historical event. I was raised in my family to be a person to think for myself. I got that from my grandfather. I got it from my mother. I was raised to oppose corruption wherever I saw it, or to oppose untruth wherever I encountered it. And I paid the price for that on an individual basis. I intended to spend my life in Kenya. I fell in love with the people of Kenya, particularly the area of Baringo. I was forced out of Kenya in 1986 by the government because I was defending the rights of ordinary Wananchi in Baringo who were being levied a tax that should have been the voluntary contributions to a thing called Harambee, where we self-help, we help build our country. And from opposing politicians for over a 2-year period, including one encounter with the president of the country, Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi, I was forced out of Kenya. I spent the most unhappy year of my life subsequently living in London, really, really missing the Baringo and the Africa that I loved because I stood up for oppression and spoke the truth. I worked in the Diocese of San Jose for 8 years, and in 1995, I was forced out of the Diocese of San Jose because I had the temerity to suggest that it was wrong that women couldn't be Catholic priests. And in 2010, I got a 2-page letter in Latin from the Vatican telling me they no longer required my services as a Catholic priest, and I couldn't represent myself as a Catholic theologian because of what they called my loss of faith and my disobedience. Every single homily I've ever given over my 48 years as a priest has been to try to speak a truth to power wherever I encountered it, including today's homily. I want to speak my truth to the situation in which I see our country right now. At the moment, if I were to listen to the voice of the wokesters, I have 5 strikes against me right now. In this particular incarnation, I have chosen to be white, to be male, to be straight, to be a follower of Jesus Christ, and to be a priest. And for those reasons, I'm one of the bad guys. If I were born in this incarnation non-white and female and transgender and atheist and militarily anti-Christian, I'd be the darling of the mob who claim to virtue is their victim identity. And so I speak up against what I see happening in our country right now. That's my third point. Point number 4, I want to talk about what I see as the war on democracy. And I'm going to make 5 subsections here. I'm going to talk about the banning of free speech. I'm going to talk about the use of slogans. I'm going to talk about the practice of shaming. And finally, what I consider the assault on the family. So for me, I'm watching democracy being dismantled in these 4 areas. Firstly, free speech. I think that the single most significant marker of a civilized society is the recognition of the right to free speech, to hold different views and to dialogue with each other and respect the views of others. In 1972, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, defended the rights of neo-Nazis to march in a little village in Illinois called Skokie, where the vast bulk of the populations were Holocaust survivors. But they were allowed to exercise their free speech. Free speech, I believe, to quote something I read recently, free speech is the ultimate disinfectant for bad ideas. It is only by allowing people to express their ideas that you can really figure out which ideas ring true and create compassion. To use the words of Thoreau this morning and the words of Benedict this morning, people who are prepared to start their day and to live their day in compassion, not in trying to shut down other people. The most significant marker of a civilization, in my opinion, that's sliding into a tyranny is the demonization of free speech. We saw this in Hitler's Germany. We saw it in Mao's China. We saw it in Pol Pot's Cambodia. We saw it in Stalin's Russia. And we're beginning to see it in the United States of America at the moment. The second assault is the use of slogans. When I look at what's happening in our universities, and I've seen this, beginning in the 60s, it's been taken over by a movement which is called postmodernism, based on the work of some French intellectuals like Derrida. And basically, in my opinion, postmodernism has created nothing or offered nothing to society. Their entire shtick is to deconstruct and to dismantle everything they find of value. Years and years ago, some crazy person attacked the extraordinary statue, the Pieta, with a hammer and did damage to it. Any crazy can destroy a work of art. Only a genius can create a work of art. The postmodernist movement, which has taken universities of America by hostage through deconstructionism, is just dismantling and destroying and adding nothing of value to the equation. We have substituted dogma for dialogue. We've substituted offensive, simplistic slogans for serious, respectful discussion. We've substituted name-calling for actual listening. And we've substituted censorship for having multi-perspectives on any issue. That's the second assault on our democracy. The third assault, I believe, is a practice of shaming. Hateful slogans which are causing good people to cower into submission in the fear that they're going to be the next group who are attacked. This is Niemuller's Germany all over again. First they came for, but I wasn't that, so I said nothing. Then they came for the second group, I wasn't that, I didn't say anything. They're going to get you at some stage. They don't care who you are, or how much you'll submit to the slogans. They'll finally come for you. Now is the time to stand up. Any parent who willfully creates self-doubt, self-hatred, and shame in a child will cause that child's personality to implode. And you're going to have a child who, at very best, is filled with anxiety and depression, and at worst, commits suicide. And any movement within a society that willfully creates self-doubt, self-hatred, and shame in a culture is going to cause that culture to implode. You're looking at another Great Depression, or you're looking at the death of the greatest experiment in democracy ever tried on planet Earth. On many occasions, you've heard me talk about fundamentalism, wherever I find it in religious thinking or in scientific thinking or in political thinking. And I claim that fundamentalism has 4 basic stages. The first stage is you take a really complex phenomenon and you reduce it to a few simplistic bumper sticker slogans. Nextly, you either identify an existing enemy, or in the absence of an enemy, you create an enemy. Stage 3 is you dehumanize that enemy, and then stage 4 is you have an all-out war against that enemy. I see our country going through that, and I've seen our country going through that for the last year. This fundamentalism of simplistic slogans, reducing very complex realities like the stratification of society, and then creating an enemy who's the bad guy, dehumanizing that person or that group, and then waging war on them. That's the third attack. And the fourth assault on democracy, I believe, is the assault on family values, where I think that free speech is the single greatest marker of a civilized society. I think the single most institution in a civilized society is the intact family system. And we find 3 versions of it in our world, in the history of our world. The one we currently favor is the nuclear family, basically the kids and the parents. There's another model out there, which is the multi-generational family. And it's kids, parents, grandparents, and sometimes even great-grandparents. And the third version of it is the extended family. So you've got kids and parents and uncles and aunts and cousins. And sometimes you even have a multi-generational extended family. That is what holds our society together. And therefore, the most devastating attack you can make on a democracy after free speech is the destruction of the culture by trying to break up the family unit. It is the family that has been the cultural glue of Africa. It has been the cultural glue of Asia, of Europe, of the Americas. It's the glue that allowed people to survive in times of great upheaval in human history, whether it was wars or famines or pandemics. It's what allowed in our own time families like the Vietnamese, who after a devastating war in their own country, there are now 1.3 million Vietnamese people living very peacefully and successfully in the United States of America. We look at, there were 6 million Jews murdered in Germany in the 1940s. What allowed them to survive and to thrive subsequently was the notion of the intact family. In February of 1942, 120,000 Japanese Americans were interned in camps on the west coast of our country. What allowed them to survive and come back into society at the end of the war and to thrive was the unity of the family. But now there's a concerted effort to destroy this institution. I was shocked a few days ago to come across a professor of sociology called Jessie Daniels from New York City University make the following statement. She said, "The white nuclear family is one of the most powerful forces supporting white supremacy." And then she went on to say that forming a white family and having white children perpetuates racism. This is one of the most sickest statements I've heard ever, coming from a sociology professor. And so I don't know what she's advocating, that white women shouldn't be allowed to marry white men, or that they shouldn't be allowed to have children, or if they do have children, they shouldn't be living together, they should be raising kids in a single parent family. In other words, stop white breeding and all racism will cease. That's one of the most extraordinary racisms I've ever heard in my life. When you look at the actual data, and you look at research of one-parent families, when you come from a one-parent family, you're 5 times more likely to live in poverty. You're 9 times more likely to drop out of high school. You're much more likely to commit suicide. You're much more likely to have behavioral disorders, not just bad behavior, an actual disorder. You are much more likely to join a gang. You're 5 times more likely to commit a crime, and you're 20 times more likely to wind up in prison than if you came from an intact family of both parents. So this is the assault on the family. These are the strikes against our democracy right now. That's my 4th point. And my 5th point, I want to try and shed some light into the future. I call this the way forward. And what I'm saying is that you can't create a vibrant, peaceful, loving future by destroying the reminders of the past, whether you're an individual person or you're an entire culture. You are who you are because you've been where you've been. And you can only get to where you want to go by honoring the journey you've been on, the successes and the failures, and learning from both. So the journey forward has to be standing on the history of where we've come from and honoring both the successes and the failures, and then moving forward in compassion for self and for other. There are no sinless people on our planet. There's not a single individual on planet Earth who's perfect or sinless. There's not a single community or group of people on planet Earth that is sinless and perfect. There's not a single nation on planet Earth that is sinless and perfect. We're all flawed beings, which is why we come here to volunteer for incarnation, to continue to grow in compassion and love, not in anger or in vitriol. And so I say today, let the person who is without sin cast the first stone. Let the group which is outside, which is sinless, lob the first Molotov cocktail. And let the nation, which is without sin, launch the first intercontinental nuclear-headed ballistic missile at somebody else. History, I believe, is the tracks of humanity on the beaches of time. We rewrite it and we obliterate these tracks, at our own peril. We have to honor our history, every part of our history, and grow from our successes and from our failures. Every one of us then needs to radically re-examine our personal cosmology. Last week, somebody made the comment after I had outlined 10 elements of my cosmology. He said, that was a very inspiring speech, but I don't agree with your cosmology. And that's absolutely perfect. I have zero problem with that. I am representing what my model is. But I tell everybody needs a model. Everybody needs a personal cosmology that should be able to do three things for you. Your personal cosmology should be consistent, and it should be able to incorporate all your own unique experiences of life. If there are data or experiences that you can't fit into your model, you don't have a good model yet. You need to create a model that can accommodate all of the experiences of your unique life. That's the first thing a personal cosmology needs to do. The second thing it needs to do is it needs to be able to help you to make sense of the world in which you live. Not just your own private experiences, but the world that you live in. It has to make sense of everything that's happening in your world. And thirdly, and very importantly, your personal cosmology has to give you tools that will allow you to move into enlightenment yourself and to help transform the world to move into an enlightened state. Your cosmology has to do those three things. And a cosmology that's based on anger and vitriol and tearing down institutions is not going to get you there. Again and again and again, the great teachers have told us, anger and fear and violence beget more anger and fear and violence. We got that from the Buddha 2,500 years ago. We got it from Jesus 2,000 years ago. We got it from Mahatma Gandhi, 80 years ago. We got it from Martin Luther King Jr. in our own lifetimes. Your cosmology must be a cosmology of love and light, not of hatred and slogan. And so my appeal is this, whoever you are and wherever you are, if you've begun to retreat into a jail cell created by your own self-doubt, self-hatred, and self-shame, wake up already and come out of the closet before you destroy yourself. Your function is to set yourself free. It is to set your family free. It is to set your nation free, and it is to set your world free. I've spoken many times of the bifurcation point we face between Homo sociopathicus and Homo spiritualis. We're very near that intersection right now. And it seems to be that Homo sociopathicus is winning the war. But you, as I keep reminding you, and I mean you, volunteered to be here on planet Earth right now in the color, in the ethnicity, in the socioeconomic status, in the religious grouping to which you belong. And from that place to transform yourself, to transform your nation and to transform your world. Time for us to wake up and be counted. Namaste.
Johanna.
I've been waiting to hear this homily from you for a long time. I really feel like this is really who you are and where you are. And I personally really needed to hear this. This really resonates with me as to exactly what we need to be doing right now to tear off the veils of what we are presented with in the media, especially because we're kind of at home, and a lot of our communication and knowledge is coming through the media, and it's really veiled about what's actually going on. And I am really touched and I'm really inspired. And thank you so much for reminding us what we need to be doing right now instead of whatever we think we need to be doing. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And
thanks, Johanna.
very courageous and wonderful homily. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you.
Call upon Sister Margaret.
Father, thank you for the homily.
Go on, Jessica.
I have a question. You said for you, you don't think there is white privilege. So I'm wondering, how would you give a comment on what you think is behind the different treatments given, for example, to a male white here and a black male white in this country?
It's a great question, and it becomes very important that we're looking at the actual data. One of the pieces of research I did for this homily was to look at the rate of homicide in our country. There is almost no interracial violence when it comes to homicide. 85% of white males who are killed by other white males. 93% of black males who are killed in this country are killed by black males. So it becomes really important whether you're looking at, crime rates, imprisonment rates, the single family rates. You have to look at all the data which are contributing to any one situation. You can't take one single factor and examine it to the exclusion of the entire jigsaw puzzle of pieces out of which it emerges. So it becomes really important when I talk about personal cosmology. You have to look at all the factors involved. I lived in Kenya, you know that. I lived in for 14 years. I saw the same violence in African society between people of the same color. When I lived in Kenya, I lived 70 miles from the Uganda border where Idi Amin was in power. Idi Amin killed 300,000 of his own people, his own countrymen. In 1994, in 1 month, in Rwanda, 800,000 Tutsis were killed with machetes by Hutu tribesmen. So every society you go to, you're going to find distinctions and stratification based on tribal affiliation, color, class, creed, religious affiliation. You have to examine the entire jigsaw puzzle before you come to simplistic conclusions that say this and only this is responsible for the situation in which we find ourselves. Go to the data, examine the data, all of the data, not just some of the data.
This is Bill Fried.
What a wonderful, wonderful homily. I do think, though, that you left out one thing that is that should be added to your list, and that's COVID-19.
Yes.
I'm going to read you, this is a quotation from Google. Influenza is a serious global health threat that impacts all countries every year. Every year, there are an estimated, are you ready for this? 1 billion cases, 3 to 5 million severe cases, and 300 to 650,000 influenza-related respiratory deaths worldwide every year. So, for the first time, our health authorities are showing us the influenza statistics of a normal flu season. The fake news media is beating the drum for the number of cases. Cases is meaningless. Cases means nothing, because most people who get a case of influenza don't suffer any symptoms at all. Those billion cases we talked about worldwide, very few of them ever sneeze or cough. So what they should be showing us is what are the number of hospitalizations and what are the number of deaths. Cases are meaningless. I would bet that 50 million people in the United States are infected with the influenza virus, but our immune systems are doing their job in protecting us from that. So thank you for a wonderful, wonderful homily. And I just wanted to share this with the rest of the people. Here's my advice. Take off your mask. Go hug your neighbor. This is over. The flu season is over. But sunshine and vitamin D is the killer of all influenza. So that's my point. Do you have any comment to that?
Yeah, and just one comment on it, Bill. So for me, this is just a case in point of what happens when free speech is denied.
Yes.
And it is not, what is not permissible to have alternative perspectives on any issue. And so, as I said, that the greatest destroyer of racism or kind of discrimination of any kind is free speech, the ability to present the data and to examine the data. And I certainly find that the pharmaceutical industry in this country has a hugely disproportionate effect on the narrative of our health in this country. Laura.
Thank you.
Good morning, Levine.
For your homily today. And I just wanted to add in something that I'm seeing about the families feeling under attack right now is I'm seeing this in our community and my practice. Families are really suffering through this pandemic. Economically, and it just really pulls on my heart. Like, luckily, Jay and I are working through this, but I just wanted to add that the pandemic, and I know it's clearly a hot topic. I won't get into those details, but schools being closed and likely not reopening, people out of work, just the family is under enormous economic pressure right now in this country.
You're absolutely right, Lauren. So that for me is, once you deplatform people and you don't allow alternative perspectives, you can't examine, for instance, what the trade-off is, in our response to the COVID, just particular. What's been the trade-off in family violence, in people losing jobs, in losing their futures, in people committing suicide, on people going on drugs. We haven't looked at what the trade-off has been for this shutdown, because it's not permissible to look at it. So if we can't look at it, we can't establish what the actual facts are and what the truth is.
Well, yes, child abuse and domestic violence are way up.
Of course.
So I just wanted to add that because it's very heartbreaking. And you talked about poverty earlier, and it's just a huge problem right now. And it doesn't look like there's going to be any end in sight, with schools opening maybe 1 to 2 days a week in the fall. So anyways, thanks for your leadership and your courage.
Okay, I'm going back to Paul, asking you to unmute. I believe you fixed.
Yeah, can you hear me right now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm actually really disappointed with this sermon, Father Sean. I've heard you before, and I love so many of the things you've said, but you completely missed the point of what's going on right now. There's a lot of people who've done exactly what you did, which is what disturbs me so much. You distilled it down to a single myopic issue, and it's not. The issue came to the surface because Black people were being killed. That's what it took for the issue to come up. But the oppression that comes across all minorities, as well as gay people, transsexuals, it's systemic. The experience you had in Ireland and the racism that happened there is the same thing, and it needed to be overcome. And so what needs to happen here is not creating white versus Black, but rather the recognition of so much of what you've preached before, is that we are all one. We are all the same. And we need to move past scenarios of saying these people are right and those people are wrong, and creating opportunities to have real dialogues. And factual issues are tough, Father Sean. I listen to your statistics, but I'm a statistician in many contexts of my life, and I can give you statistics that completely change the dynamic of what you're saying. So I'd really caution you to say, look at this, what you're saying is important, and we shouldn't have us versus them in any context. But characterizing what's happening now in the unfortunate name of Black Lives Matter as being simply about Black Lives Matter over other lives is a mischaracterization.
So I make a few responses to that, Paul. Firstly, I totally allow you the freedom to think what you think and to speak your truth. And I accept that I have the same right to do it. You're misrepresenting me completely if you think that this homily has been a single issue. I've gone over about 100 different points. I've used evidence from several different areas. So to characterize it as something that's just dealt with a single issue, I never ever use the phrase Black Lives Matter in today's homily, because there's lots more to it. I've used evidence from several different places, my own history, my own family, and to reduce an argument and claim that I reduced to a single incident is to do a kind of a disfavor completely to what I've just tried to accomplish. In the past, I've challenged all kinds of injustice. I set up an 18-month-long seminar among my own community in 2012 to look at the abuse of education, agriculture, ecology, finances, justice, the military, the pharmaceuticals, all these pieces. I've examined all of those. And in a half-hour homily, I can't pretend to revisit all of those topics in complete detail. But I've given you a fairly good representation of many of the issues, and I stand by my statistics and my research.
Can I ask you, Sean, perhaps to, in this question, to, restate your position on whether this is a single issue or whether this is many issues and how we respond to these issues?
This is in one of the points I made, I talked about just one point on the war on democracy. I talked about 4 different kinds of assaults. Just under one point, I had 4 sub-pieces. Yep. I looked at American history. Yep. I looked at my own journey as an individual and as a member of my own race. I looked at my time in Africa. I looked at shaming, free speech, family values. I looked at the way forward. I looked at the Japanese culture. I looked at the Vietnamese culture. I looked at the Jewish culture. If I haven't given you enough data to make you realize that I've covered a whole bunch of stuff, even in this one homily, then you haven't been listening.
Can I go back to Laurie?
To something that really touches my heart. It's been so sad to see all this unrest in our country. I live in one little small town in Vermont where we have a school principal that posted "All Lives Matter," those words, on her Facebook page, and she was fired from her job. And so now on one corner we have Black Lives Matter, and in another corner we have, the opposite. And in this teeny little Vermont town, and there's so much sadness. And I really, I feel like people like it in a way, because in this uncertain time, it really grounds them. Their belief system is like protecting them and makes them feel solid. And then they don't have to worry about this thing that might kill them any day. So I just feel like there's so much more to it. We all want the best, but I feel like we're just stuck, That's where my faith is, that I can just stay with the uncertainty. I just wanted to put that out there. Love really grounds me. That word just grounds me, because I do think that I have white blindness. I don't know. I'm white. I don't want to have white privilege, but anyway, I'm German too, So anyway, that's what I wanted to say. I think Aaron had the question. I stole his time.
Sure.
Maybe we could focus and speak to the reality in English, the English language, which I have to almost apologize for. Color, culture, data, science, those sort of things need to we almost need a definition of terms. So I was hoping you could speak to that, Sean, in relation to Benedict and Thoreau and yourself.
Every language, Aaron, there are about 7,000 languages spoken on our planet. Each language is not just a different set of physical sounds to represent stuff in the external world. A language creates mindset. And so the words you use creates mindset. Every language is a single perspective on life on planet Earth. Depending on climate, depending on environment, depending on geography, depending on culture, depending on history, languages evolve and create their own ways of dealing with it. And none of them is perfect. Every one of them is a partial perspective. And therefore it becomes really important that we don't harass each other, that we dialogue with each other, to make sure that our use of particular words are understood by other people in the same way. The greatest linguist of the 20th century was a guy called Ferdinand de Saussure, who was he was a Swiss linguist, and he claimed that language consists of 3 elements. There's the referent in the real world. There's the signified, which is the mental image, and then there's a signifier, the words you use. So if I'm walking in the savannah in Kenya and I encounter a giraffe, and nobody had ever seen a giraffe before, firstly, there's the object in the real world. Secondly, I create some kind of an internalized image. It is part visual, it's part olfactory, it's part auditory, but I've got an image in my head which is called the signified. And then I try to tell you about it, I'm going to have to use words. If I'm speaking Swahili, I'm going to say twiga. If I'm speaking English, I'm going to say giraffe. But at each of these three phases, I have no guarantee that you understand my language the way in which I understand it. Firstly, we have no idea whether the stuff in the external world actually is real. All we can say is that when the sensorium has operated on it and the mind has processed it, there is a particular kind of image formed. But it's called the myth of the given. The myth of the given in philosophy is a fallacy that says the external world, is represented in a one-to-one mapping by our internal version of it. It's not. We have no idea what's out there. If you were a dragonfly or a bat, you'd have a totally different version of life on planet Earth than being a human being. So the first problem is we have no idea whether or not our images are actually one-to-one mapping on the referent. Then secondly, when I choose to speak, I have no idea whether or not my language is adequate to confer the signified, and moreover, when I use a particular word, I have no guarantee that you understand that word the way I understand it. In fact, in order to try to explain to you what I mean by the word I'm using, I'm going to have to use other words to explain it. And by multiplying words, I'm multiplying opportunities for us to misunderstand each other. So language is a huge piece. It's a beautiful piece because it gives us a perspective on all life situations. And it's by putting the perspectives together that we can create a God's eye view of life on planet Earth. Not by being caught or prejudiced within one language or one set of kind of ideas. It's by sharing ideas with other people. And that's what I'm saying, that the way forward has to be a loving dialogue, not just casting slurs and slogans at each other. That's only going to create more and more violence in our world. And anybody who's advocating and acting in violence is totally creating a world of future violence. It's not going to work. It's never worked. Hasn't worked in 5,000 years. It's not working now, and it won't work in the future.
Andrea.
I really loved the first part about, the democracy. That was so, it just was really like a breath of fresh air, to hear about how our country was formed and the progress that we've made. I think it's really important to focus on that progress. Secondly, I want to just say that I agree with you that it's more an issue of privilege or class. I do agree with you that we have to look at privilege and class. And I agree with you that, shaming any group, is not okay. Of course, I agree that, violence is not the answer. Shaming is not the answer. Judgment is not the answer. We have to love everyone. But I just want to say 2 points. One is that, the concept of white privilege, this is what I believe it is. I don't believe it's about shaming. And I'm sad to hear, that horrible quote that sociology professor, that is just horrific. That's really not okay. However, I do think the concept of white privilege is helpful in that the whole concept is for us, people of privilege, to understand our privilege and to understand that it's not that way for everyone. So there are people of color who have to wake up every day and worry about things that we don't have to worry about. And that is real. And so I think that is the concept of white privilege, is just to have empathy. That's simply to have empathy and to have understanding that there are people of color that get pulled over, at a higher rate than people who are white. And so I just was curious if you could talk about the issue of police brutality. Doesn't that? Of course, there are good police and mostly good police, and then we have other issues of police brutality. So I'm just curious with your statistics, if you have done any work, like, isn't it true that the police pull over more people of color? Can you just talk about that a little bit?
I don't want to get into the color issue specifically, but I will say this, that as far as, for instance, the statistics actually show that a white policeman is much less likely to shoot an unarmed African American than to shoot an unarmed other white person. They're the statistics. So when you actually go to the raw data, there is a belief out there which is not in accordance with the actual data out there. I totally agree that, like any institution, the police needs to be radically overhauled. So there's the justice system. So there's the educational system. So there's agriculture. So there's the pharmaceutical. I've spent my entire lifetime in America talking about the corruption of all of these institutions. But the way forward has to be dealing with free speech, real data, and has to come out of a loving belief in a compassionate future that we fashion together by talking to each other, not by trading slogans.
I call upon Eric. Go ahead.
Hi, Father Sean.
Hey, Eric.
Hey, thank you very much for the homily. I thought it was brilliant. And I just wanted to add, when you're talking about the deterioration of culture as a whole and democracy, I think what is at the root of it is secularism and the subversion of the education system and culture in general for ridiculing and mocking people that talk about God in any creed. And if you look at the bedrock of the founding documents of this country that you talked about, the founding fathers talked about how we're all created in the image of God, and it wasn't necessarily Christian, but it was more like mysticism. And I feel that looking at the 20th century, all of the atrocities that took place, it could all be stemmed from the subversion of the youth and the lack of God being present in the culture. And so I guess my question is, how can we bring that back and stop the categorization of people and realize that we all are fragments of God?
Right. That's a brilliant remark, Eric. So I always remember on first Sunday after 9/11, where I made this urgent appeal in a homily that rather than retaliate against the perpetrators of this atrocity, we should declare a moratorium on war and bring together over a 5-year period the great thinkers of the world, agriculturalists, economists, justice people, psychologists, medical people, agriculturists, ecologists, and have a 5-year moratorium where we try to figure out how do we need to move forward as a human species, united as a species, by redressing the imbalances and the injustices in all those places. Of course, we did the opposite. We went in and we attacked Afghanistan. So we met violence with more violence. We need to be thinking as a human community. We need to be putting all of the issues on the table simultaneously, even though some people will focus on particular areas because we can't cover everything. Everybody can't cover everything. We need to cover everything as a family. So some people will specialize in particular areas. But we can only do that if we're trying to create the jigsaw puzzle of life on planet Earth, using all of the pieces and using all of the people to contribute their insights into the formation of the jigsaw puzzle. We're not going to create it by destroying pieces or by just focusing on one tiny segment of the jigsaw puzzle and then doing it with anger against people who are working on other pieces of it. This needs to be a united effort on the part of all human beings, covering all human institutions, recognizing all of our history as individual nations and as a global family, and trying to move forward in compassion and love, not by finger pointing and creating slogans.
I call on Laz Desiree.
First of all, just thank you so much, Father Sean, for creating a space for this discussion. I'm kind of new to the community, so I feel grateful to be here. And with 68 participants, I don't know, I feel like it's a great conversation. I noticed in my body when the man began to talk about the flu, and then my friend Paul had his strong opinions about the flu, and then that sort of exchange that happened, I noticed my heart rate went up. I got short of breath. I began to wonder what data even is, as much as it's this only thing we can like grasp onto on some level right now, because you can use statistics to say one thing and you can use statistics to say another thing. And I've been trying to just, when I feel that feeling of like I can't breathe and my heart's pounding and there's various information that's flooding my brain from all different sources, and then I also have to like decide how to act as a human being right now. But at that time I just have to take a step back and kind of just like breathe and take a step backwards and try to remember who I am. And I just wanted to say that I think each of us is immensely more creative than we have any concept of. And that when our mind is flooded in that manner that I just described, we are disconnected from that actual thing that is that homo spiritualis, that thing, that power, that thing that we're trying to evolve to. When we feel that way, that we're flooded, I just don't think we have any access to what actually brings us forward. And I wondered if you could speak to Father Sean. I've just seen in my life that asking good questions and asking the right questions, like, for example, some of the questions I'm asking lately, and maybe you can speak to some of the questions you're asking about moving forward. What would it feel like to have a government I trusted? If there was a president I wanted to vote for, what would they be talking about? If there was a way that I felt inside of my church community that felt really like Jesus would like it, what would that feel like? And questions about what it would feel like to be in a different reality than this one where I can't breathe and my heart's pounding and I'm flooded with information. I feel an inclination that by imagining something different than what we have now, it sort of builds a bridge to a different thing than we currently have. So I wonder if you're asking questions like that. I think you set out a thing about 2020. Can you guide us into those kind of questions that lead us to a feeling of being flooded?
So that's a great response, Desiree. So you talk about the physiological reaction you had to the discussion today. You're the mother of 2 children. Did you have the same kinds of physiological reactions to being in labor? Probably you did. And so we're in labor as a human species right now. It's going to happen. We're not going to give birth to a new reality without suffering some kinds of labor pains. So we have to accept that there's going to be a lot of discomfort on all sides as our viewpoints are being challenged. As long as we're challenging each other with loving hearts and with real data, not with slogans delivered in anger. And so then there's a whole bunch of questions that need to be examined. And I spend my life as a priest looking at some of those areas, looking at as many of those areas as I can. So I can't just say, here's one question that needs to be asked and here's another question. All of these questions need to be asked. As I said, 10 years ago, we created an 18-month-long seminar in COJ, looking at all of the institutions of modern life and examining, how they need to proceed forward. That's what needs to happen. Everybody needs to be involved in that dialogue. Some people will choose to focus on particular arenas because they're particularly passionate about it or they're knowledgeable in it, and that's great, as long as it's done in love, with real data and free speech. And eventually, if enough of us get involved in the dialogue, we'll ask all of the important questions. And we'll be asking of it because we want to create an entire jigsaw puzzle, not just focus on one segment of it. So any question you ask is important. And listening to the responses you get from other people who are in a loving, compassionate dialogue with you will reach a synthesis. But there's no synthesis possible if all we're doing is focusing on one issue and just bombarding each other with hateful slogans.
Margaret McGrath.
There's so many things that are whirling around in my mind right now. Sean, that was a wonderful, wonderful explanation of a lot of what's going on today. There's something I'd like to add, though, not to what you said, but to look on another side of what's going on, especially with COVID and everybody being shut down. I'm in my little cocoon here, but it doesn't keep me from knowing what's going on in my family. And we have the wonderful technology of FaceTime and Zooming that I can talk to my family in Ireland. I can participate in a birthday party in Ireland. I'm not any longer cut off from face-to-face communication. And it's the same thing with my children. I have 5 grandchildren. And what I'm seeing in their families, and I'm seeing in a lot of the families of my friends' children, is that this COVID has brought everybody home. We're sitting around a dinner table where that was so rare. It was even very difficult to get somebody to, all of the family together on a Sunday afternoon for dinner, which was like traditional in many, many families, and many of you remember that. But now I see their children and parents, and both parents, because both parents have to work at home, are sitting around the breakfast table talking about the schedule for the day, coming together again at lunch and talking about what they've been learning. And a lot of them have Zoom classroom, but they have a schedule, and there's a schedule that's within the home that facilitates families drawing closer together. It facilitates parents not giving the education of their children to the outside world, but coming to know what their children are learning and learning with their children. Because their lives today, we cannot even imagine in school. And how they process what's going on in their lives is something we need to tap into. And to be given, first of all, opportunities to sit together and talk and share our feelings and have respect for the feelings of every person in the family, from the smallest to the oldest. And each feeling and each thought is being seen as special to that person, which is something that we have lost in our society. We do not come together as families, only to party. We don't do a day-to-day, let's support each other. Let's learn what each other's lives are like. Not only children learning about their parents, but parents learning about their children. If you have a child in middle school, do you know what middle school is like? Do you know what middle school in the inner city is like? I spent over 50 years working in the inner city of Buffalo as an educator. And I can tell you that my own husband, who was a superintendent of schools out here in the suburbs, had no clue about the lives these children had to live. But their parents didn't either, because people did not talk to each other. I keep thinking there is a blessing here, a great, great blessing, because it's bringing us back to a core feeling of what it is to be a member that's respected in a family and respects everybody else.
Great comment, Margaret. So this will be the last response, because it's I've been at this now for an hour. We need to get on with Mass. You're absolutely right. And so when you look at the history of our entire universe, there has never been a significant evolutionary shift that was not, created by some kind of a crisis. Unless the first, generation of stars went supernova, there would be no solar system and no planet Earth. unless there had been the crisis, the oxygen crisis on planet Earth 3.7 billion years ago, when the initial life forms couldn't handle oxygen, it was killing them, so they had to develop a mitochondria inside in the cell that could metabolize and energize it. You know, again and again and again in our history, geologically, cosmically, and as human beings, it has great crises that have moved us forward if we harvested it correctly. And I agree with you. This opportunity we're in right now is an opportunity to birth Homo spiritualis, but it involves all of us getting involved in it, and it involves, you know, working with the contractions. If we try to stop the contractions, we're going to damage the baby and be in long pain. So we have to work with the contractions. We have to look at all of the issues as a unified human species and put our shoulder to the wheel out of love and compassion, and to move forward into Homo spiritualis and abandon all of this kind of slogans, you know, and divisions. So I'm going to leave it there, guys, and continue with the Eucharist. Thanks a million for this great discussion today.